Hey, welcome to Bridges Live. This is Dr. Paul, and I like to thank all my sponsors and all my listeners. And as you can tell, my voice is leaving me here on Bridges Live, but that's okay. You know, we push through. We do what we can. I like to thank all my active people who come on the show because this is what this is all about when it comes to Bridges Live, and that's information, understanding, and action. And I have another great guest that come on. Z, come on into Bridges Live. Thank you.
Hey, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Hey, please introduce yourself, because I just think, introductions are kind of weird for me, because it's like you're introducing someone to like a ball game, so it's almost kind of weird. It's like, and the next batter up is Z Beams.
Sure, no problem. So my name is Z Beams. I'm a pediatrician in Howard County. I've been working here in Howard County for about a little over 10 years. And I met Dr. Paul through boxing.
Yeah, so, I bet you must get a lot of weird looks when you're a pediatrician working with kids, and then they're like, you box? And then you're like, yeah. They're like, oh, how weird. Do you get a lot of those looks and comments?
I do get a lot of that. I get a lot of people who don't really understand what boxing is really about or why it's so interesting to me. And a lot of folks that ask, well, isn't that like really violent? And, they just kind of associate it with concussions. That's the other big thing where they're like, why do you do something so dangerous for your brain? And, so, my answer is a few things. First of all, I have boxed competitively long time ago. And back then, probably was a little bit more at risk, but we wore headgear. It's amateur boxing, so you protect your head. And so that's one thing. But nowadays, non-combat boxing, I like to say, at Title Boxing where we met Dr. Paul. And so you're hitting the bag. So competition is much more directly, if it is even competition, it's really against yourself and your mind and, kind of pushing yourself to do your best, not doing any harm to anybody else. So it's a really good way to get some really good exercise, get your body health, but also get your mind focused in the moment and just kind of sharp,
It's funny how people have a hard time working on something to get their mind clear so they can do other things.
Yeah, and it's so important. All of the types of fitness that I like to do, I consider them a moving meditation. And I think boxing is definitely one of those. It's sort of, you've got to let everything else that you could be thinking about fall to the side and then just really focus on what you're doing, not just with your body, but with your presence of mind. And you got to stay right in that moment. I feel the same way about whether it's running or yoga or my other two favorite forms of exercise. And I always say it's a moving meditation. Breathe in, breathe out, and move your body. And so that's what's attractive to me about boxing too.
So thank you so much, and because it's a blessing for everybody to come listen to Bridges Live, and we're talking to Dr. Z Beams, but you started a program with your practice for helping others, didn't you?
Yeah, so I can tell you a little bit about, this is a project I'm really, really excited about. We're going to kind of rewind about 10 years ago. I read a book called The Happiness Project, and the premise of the book is where the author kind of decides to take a few different categories of her life and try to make one habit change in that category per month and collect those habit changes and see if it helps her feel better. And I was really taken with the idea of just taking small targeted interventions to help your mental health and wellness. And fast forward about 5 years, I started seeing a real steep increase in mental health challenges and mental health concerns in kids and their parents in my practice. And what I learned when folks needed more and more support for mental health concerns is that it's really hard to get mental health care. So for every 500 individuals seeking care, there's one provider out there. That's one thing. There's just way more demand than supply. But then the other problem is, of course, that by the time somebody seeks care, they've often been suffering for years, at least months or weeks, but sometimes years. And then they've decided to reach out, and once they get to where they, can't take it anymore, and then it's going to take weeks to find a provider that'll take their insurance or have availability, and then it'll take weeks to get an appointment with that provider. And then they may not take their insurance, and then those people may not have the flexibility to take the time to spend an hour a week or every couple weeks going to counseling or therapy and working on the problems. So I became very frustrated with this situation, and I saw more and more young people suffering with mental health concerns until finally a year ago this weekend, actually, our community lost a young man to suicide, death by suicide, and I just kind of decided that I couldn't let this happen in our community anymore and became much more proactive about working on this program I've developed with a colleague. So I became, very determined to do whatever I can to address the mental health crisis in young people. So I reached out to a counselor that I had very good experiences with and who I respect a lot, and asked her to kind of help me with this. And she came up with the idea of using this 40-year-old concept of a wellness wheel.
Right.
And the wellness wheel is basically an idea that takes anywhere between 6 and 9 categories of your life and tries to evaluate them and through a series of questions. And so the categories are, for example, physical, social, emotional, environmental, financial, professional, intellectual. Some folks do a spiritual category. And most wellness wheels consist of a series of questions that kind of investigate each category. And then what we've done to innovate is that in addition to the investigative survey, we've created a menu of strategic interventions or micro strategies that you can use in a targeted way to use the information you learn from the inventory to help to improve your wellness and prevent depression and anxiety.
Z, one of the things you said that it stands out, and I've interviewed a lot of people around the world who is just putting their hands into the dirt and saying, we need to make a difference. And that's one of the things that I hope Bridges Live does to people, is to say they can hear this and say, I too can make a difference. Because you got sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I know that's an old saying that people have said before, like, things don't change until they get sick and tired of being sick and tired. But one of the things you pointed out is people just also, even if they wanted to help, they may not financially be able to afford to help.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's a couple things that are that address that concern. A couple things about the project that I'm working on. One is that I consider this to be a preventive approach. So one thing that concerns me is, just like with any other prevention, whether it's smoking causing lung cancer, or other kinds of, diet causing heart disease over time. Same thing with mental health. It's in some situations there's just a very direct biochemical imbalance that has to be addressed in a very medical way. But in most cases, it's long-standing missteps. It's one misstep after another kind of leads us down the wrong path and builds into this sort of, just thickened kind of set of problems. And it's much harder to fix that, 10 years after those habits are in place than it is to build good habits and build a healthy mental health approach from the beginning. So I consider this is another innovative thing about this project, is I consider it preventive mental health, not necessarily corrective. It can be corrective, but my drive is to prevent the problems from beginning in the first place. And the other thing that's innovative about this program is I don't see it as sort of like a tool to use one-on-one in a therapeutic or counseling context. I would like to get this program deployed broadly at the community level, so in schools, in colleges, in religious communities that have a broad reach, so that it's a large number of people at once. And the other benefit that you get from taking that kind of approach where you're preventive and you're deploying at a community scale as opposed to with one person sitting alone in their room is that you build community connection. So the social elicitation of the strategies builds connection within the cohort that's doing it. And of course, the loss of connection to community is one of the underlying root causes of depression and anxiety and suicide.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we're community animals. We are meant to have connections, and connections means communications, and communications means understanding one another, not just being around someone or listening to someone. I'm talking understanding one another. Most people will talk to a person throughout the day and never really connect. And if you're not connecting, I don't know if that's communication.
Yep, absolutely. And the less you are able to clearly communicate, the more and more isolated a person, especially a young person, can become. And then that leads to these not just feelings of depression, anxiety, despair, but also kind of misguided habits. You know, we all know we can get into these flawed thinking, patterns, and then get into bad mental and emotional habits that then lead us, into not the best mental health.
I know a lot of kids are committing suicide. I know I actually did an interview several months ago about how it's on the rise with the ages of between 14 and 18. Man, I know certain communities have more suicide than most, but yet, suicide is for me personally, I know I was at the brink at one time in my life when I didn't feel like anyone was listening to me. So I know exactly where you're at when it comes to asking for help and looking for the community and looking for support. I think it's like why do we have to wait till someone scream in sickness before we have that help? And that's where that preventative comes in.
Yeah, and I think, thank you for sharing that, because I think, I would say, we know that about 22 to 30% of young people are suffering from depression and anxiety right now. That's 1 in 5. We know that. That's who is coming, for help. It's probably more than that. It's probably closer to 35 or 40. And so, it's important for those of us who do suffer from depression and anxiety or early forms of that to speak up about it, one, so that it's not as stigmatized and people around us don't feel so concerned about sharing their own needs, but two, because it helps us learn from each other about, what it sounds like you found your path out of that. And so when you come forward and say, I've been in this place myself,
right.
It allows the people around you to learn, well, what strategy did you use to dig yourself out of that, place, and how do you maintain your wellness now? And, you and I have talked a little bit about, how one of the ways that both of us do that is exactly what we're talking about, staying connected to the people around us.
Right.
And talking, just talking about who we are, where we are, what we value. And so I think it's really, really important that people do come forward when they're having those feelings and concerns, so they can get help, and also so that we can all help each other.
Do you think it's almost fascinating I wonder if we can go up to people and I've done this before, and ask people how are they feeling today, and they look at me like, I don't know you, but, I stand there waiting for an answer. with a smile on my face, and then they're able to open up going, I'm doing good, thank you for asking. And I just don't think they feel like they're being seen, people are hitting, like homelessness. People feel like, when I work with homeless people or work with anybody who feels like they've been abandoned by our social system, our society, our community, our families, that's when it doesn't seem like I'm taking my life. I'm getting rid of garbage, because no one sees me anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some really interesting research in the past 3 to 5 years that talks about the different levels of connection that people have and how those positively impact us. So there's always been talk of, or for years there's been talk of how people's physical health is better the more friendships and close relationships they have, or that people in long-term partnerships, personal, intimate partnerships, are generally tend to do better in terms of their public health and health measures. But in recent years, it's actually been also shown, and of more interest to the public health community, that people with a lot of lower level or lighter level connections tend to have better health physically and mental health. And so, for example, you and I have talked about, for example, I have people that I consider my friends at the bank, the grocery store,
right,
the gym, pretty much everywhere I go, I make friends with people and I have connections to those people, and it just makes you feel better to be, like you said, to feel like they're noticing, you're noticing. I changed my grocery shopping routine a little bit, and one of the folks that works there, when I went back to my regular time, he said, I haven't seen you in a while. Is everything okay? Have you been away? And
that's
so it's
awesome.
kind of like somebody noticed that I wasn't there, So, in fact, I continue to go to the bank in person every Friday precisely because it's like those people, I'm connected to them, and they're going to be keeping an eye on me. They're going to wonder if I miss a week or two.
And that,
I do that.
And to me, like, one of my staple things I fight, I champion a lot of things, but human trafficking, people wonder how human trafficking can happen. Is because people are taken because they're not being missed. And that seems, it goes hand in hand. How can a person not miss their child? Well, let's just go with a child. Well, they're 16. I know they're okay. They're not home. It's 8 o'clock. It's not that big a deal. But I haven't had a connection with my child. I'm not saying you have to know where they are, but what are you up to? How come your child doesn't say, I'm over at friend A or B's house, or I'll be late? That simple communication keeps us safe.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
And when it comes to child suicide, again, I know everyone is feeling the pain in the community that you're around, that is now a year gone, but it's even though it's a year gone, nothing is, we don't forget. Matter of fact, we remember harder.
Yeah. It's kind of amazing to think about how quickly a year passes by, and then here you are, and so just to kind of like put a little structure on this, you mentioned things like social connections, but when you go through the wellness wheel concept, I always like to start in the physical health category for obvious reasons. That's my specialty, and that's where that's my wheelhouse, no pun intended. And so you start with things like nutrition, physical activity, sleep, social media use, and health maintenance, and you investigate if you're meeting guidelines in all of those areas. And so, you mentioned with teens, you mentioned a 16-year-old or, young people that are at risk for human trafficking. Imagine if that imaginary person's family were eating dinner together every day, their family were paying attention to what they were eating. They were expected to be in bed at a certain time and stay in bed for a certain amount of time. They were putting away their devices when they went to bed, and they were, being attended to in terms of health maintenance visits. Literally just those simple things create connection and awareness and can alert you to problems, bigger problems like, hey, wait a minute, this kiddo, isn't seeming right. Like, it's little clues end up coming up. And if you don't think about physical health is so separated from, for example, human trafficking, theoretically. But if you start there with that bedrock, then you're already building in habits that will prevent, somebody going down that kind of a road. And then you start to think about social habits. For example, do you have 3 people in your life you can trust? Do you feel comfortable having difficult conversations with family members? Are you participating in community events? When all those things are identified as things that we should be doing to maintain our wellness and then conscientiously acted upon, it makes it less likely for something bigger like human trafficking or homelessness or death by suicide to erupt or seem to erupt out of the blue.
And that's the key word. It's less likely. We're not trying. When we talk about prevention, we talk about helping and making us a better world. We can only get better if we do better. I remember one of my sons. And I have 9 kids. So when my son was a very quiet boy, and his mother was like, well, he's just quiet. I was like, and he was like 12. And I said, you know what? I don't care how quiet he is. I went into his room and I said, listen, I'm going to tell you this. And you can take it for what it's worth, but you're going to have to talk to me every day. And the reason why is because I want to know where you're at. And that was important to me. Now, I know you're like, what do I need to talk about? What is there to talk about? I don't care what it is. And I'm not giving you what we need to talk about, but I want to hear your voice. I want to feel I want to feel who you are. And he really understood what I was coming from, because I tell him, I said, if we lose connection, we lose our lives. And I'm big on that. So.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And, what's really interesting is that, so you then, when you think about the wellness wheel concept, you can go in any order, but, if we're talking about physical as the bedrock, and then you talk about social connections, and then you start talking about, your home environment. So you talk about, do you have private space? Do you have a safe, clean home? Do you spend time outside in nature? And again, so you just described a scenario where, your son did have some private space that you were able to go and meet him in and have a trusting, loving conversation. So you were unknowingly kind of acting on all of those components and guidelines, but not everybody intuitively knows those, and not everybody grows up being trained in those ways, and I think you can be, and you can practice those and turn them into little habits that build into, strategies for living a good life.
So I want to let people know you're listening to Bridges Live. This is Dr. Paul. I'm talking to Dr. Z Beams, and she's talking about a program that we want to implement about preventative care. How can people start this program? Do they contact you? Is this something that they can pick up on? Well, how do we do this now?
Yeah, so right now I'm in the process of reaching out to mostly educational institutions, and to see if there's interest in putting these programs into, for example, health curriculum in schools. And I'm working with a private school and getting ready to speak with some folks in other school environments as well. But yes, absolutely. You can find me on the internet. So my name is Dr. Beams, Beams. I have a website. It's drbeams.com. There are Facebook pages for Rubix Wellness and Rubix Mental Health, as well as for my practice, which is called Dr. Beams Medical Home, and you can contact me through any of those outlets. If anybody is interested in putting this program in place in a for example, a church community or another kind of a community, it would be really fun to work on doing that. I like to customize the program for the audience. So, for example, over the next 3 months, I'm going to be working with a group of educators in Delaware, actually, who are interested in improving equity and inclusion in schools in the Wilmington area specifically, which is kind of a challenged city. And I'm going to be working with these educators to take the Rubix wellness and mental health approach kind of to their own lives, so that when they go into these challenged areas, they're sort of at their best in all of these components of themselves, and then they can bring their best into the classrooms. I'm kind of customizing the programs specifically for the educational and educator environment in that situation, and can pretty easily customize it for other environments. For example, if it were a spiritual community, an athletic community, I can imagine a gym doing this, for example, a team or a series of teams, a company, larger companies that have wellness programs for their employees would be another exciting context for something like this. But I'm really excited about the idea of doing it with teens and young adults, because that's where people are really kind of getting traction and starting to build their independent habits, for their adult life.
Well, I just know we can only, and I'll say this over and over, we got to do better being better. And the only way we can do better being better is to say, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, and we didn't make a difference. And Dr. Z, you're doing that. You're making a difference. And that's why I was so fortunate, blessed to have you as a friend in the club, but to know that, we're outside of this. This is more building of our community and just building this thing that we can live a whole, complete life. That's amazing.
Absolutely, yep.
Thank you, Z, for everything. And again, thank you. Remember, people contact her. The contact is going to be on the podcast. And so you get on the podcast link, and I'll have all the information so you can contact the Rubix information, and so you can implement this. If you have any questions, please reach out to Dr. Z Beams. And thank you. And for everybody listening to Bridges Live, I'm Dr. Paul, and I will see you again next week.